Oh yeah? Ever have a talking doll rip out your voice box?
Ooh, show me that smile. New boy in the neighborhood.
Remember those 80s sitcoms that started strong, then went on way too long? These shows once lit up our living rooms, shaped our routines, and gave us characters we talked about like family. But somewhere along the way, did we stop laughing and just keep watching out of habit? So what exactly happens when a heartfelt family sitcom goes full cartoon? Well, if you grew up watching television in the late 1980s and into the 1990s, chances are you already know the answer. You started off with stories about parenting, growing up, and finding your place in the world. And before you knew it, a kid in suspenders was time-traveling in a rocket suit he built in his garage. That is Family Matters in a nutshell. It all started with promise. The Winslow family, hardworking, middle class, and living in Chicago, felt like people you could actually know. Harriet was practical and loving, Carl was the gruff but fair dad type, and the kids each had their own quirks without veering into caricature. It was a spin-off of Perfect Strangers, believe it or not, but it quickly found its own rhythm. Early seasons dealt with relatable family tension, school troubles, and the pressures of work, love, and growing up Black in America. Not every sitcom was doing that at the time, not with this kind of sincerity. The emotional stakes felt grounded. The show had something to say about the real-life challenges families were facing, especially in urban America. It wasn't just feel-good, it was relevant. And then came Steve Urkel. Now, Steve was not even supposed to be a main character. Originally introduced for just one episode, the writers probably thought he would be a quick gag and gone. Instead, audiences fell in love with him. Nerdy voice, oversized glasses, suspenders and all. He was like if science fair projects became a human being. It was impossible to look away, and to be fair, Jaleel White's performance was genuinely iconic. He made Urkel unforgettable. Kids dressed like him. Adults quoted him. The network noticed. Ratings shot up, and suddenly, everything revolved around Steve. But here is the catch. Steve Urkel took over everything. What began as a show about a loving, realistic family dynamic gradually became a platform for increasingly bizarre sci-fi antics. Steve cloned himself. Steve turned into a suave alter ego named Stefan. Steve got stuck in various inventions, fell into time loops, and practically became a mad scientist. The Winslow family slowly got pushed out of the spotlight, until most of them barely had storylines at all. Judy, the youngest daughter, was literally written out of existence without a word. She went upstairs and never came back down. No explanation, nothing. Just gone. It is easy to say, well, that is television. And sure, television evolves. But Family Matters stopped evolving in a way that made emotional sense. It began stretching itself thinner and thinner, hoping a laugh track and another Urkel mishap would carry it through. And for a while, it did. The show ran for 9 seasons, but by the end, you could tell the heart was gone. The stories were tired. The warmth that made the Winslows so relatable had been replaced with endless slapstick. The family's values took a back seat to spectacle, and with each episode, it became harder to remember how it all began. There is something quietly tragic about that. This was a show that once gave us gentle, grounded lessons about family, friendship, and identity. It ended in a strange place, full of gimmicks, guest stars, and so many bizarre inventions that you needed a flowchart just to keep up with the plot. It is not that Steve Urkel ruined the show. It is that the show forgot what it was in the first place, and when that happens, the audience notices, even if they keep watching anyway. How do you outgrow your own premise? Different strokes might have the answer. This was one of those shows that struck a chord with people the moment it hit the air in the late 1970s. 2 young Black boys from Harlem, Arnold and Willis Jackson, are taken in by a wealthy white businessman, Mr. Drummond, after their mother, his former housekeeper, passes away. It sounds heavy on paper, but the tone was light. It had heart, humor, and a moral center that aimed to say something about race, class, and the meaning of family. In its prime, Different Strokes was more than just good television. It was appointment viewing. Kids imitated Arnold's famous catchphrase, "What you talking about, Willis?" And adults appreciated the show's effort to address real social issues in a format that still felt like fun. The kids, played by Gary Coleman and Todd Bridges, were naturals. Coleman especially became a breakout star, with a wit and timing that made him unforgettable. But stardom like that is a double-edged sword. The spotlight stayed fixed on Arnold long after the story stopped making sense. And when a child actor becomes a cultural icon, but the actor ages, it gets complicated. Gary Coleman was diagnosed early in life with a kidney condition that stunted his growth. As a result, he looked much younger than he actually was. This worked early on. He played a child when he was already well into his teens, but as the seasons dragged on, the illusion started to strain. You could feel it. The show was aging, and not gracefully. By the time the show moved networks in the mid-1980s, things had changed. Writers struggled to come up with new storylines that were not just retreads. The cast shifted. New characters were added. Old ones vanished. Plots became increasingly outlandish or irrelevant. It was no longer about what it was like to merge two different worlds into one family. It became about keeping up appearances, stretching a concept that had already finished telling its story. The last seasons were especially rough. Arnold was in high school, but still talking and acting like a fourth grader. The chemistry felt off. You could see the exhaustion in the performances, hear it in the laugh track. Even the show's moral lessons, once a strength, started feeling hollow, more like afterthoughts than anything deeply felt. And the behind-the-scenes drama did not help. Legal troubles, contract disputes, and personal struggles made headlines far more than the show itself by the end. But maybe what hurts the most is this. Different Strokes had something special. It was trying to say something big through a small, funny lens. And for a while, it succeeded. But it stayed too long at the party. When it finally ended, it was not a triumphant farewell. It was a quiet exit, a sigh of relief. The kind of ending that feels more like a mercy than a celebration. It always starts with laughter, does it not? A suburban family, a living room full of soft lighting, and a theme song so wholesome it makes you feel like everything is going to be okay. That was Growing Pains in its early years, a sitcom that wore its heart on its sleeve and genuinely cared about showing what it meant to be part of a loving but imperfect family. But when you stretch that same formula across 7 long seasons, things begin to feel different, familiar, tired, like someone trying to tell the same joke over and over, just louder this time. The Seaver family had a pretty clever setup for its time. Jason Seaver, a psychiatrist, decided to work from home so his wife Maggie could go back to her career in journalism. That flipped the usual dynamic and gave the show a strong starting point. You had Alan Thicke doing the straight man dad thing with perfect ease, Joanna Kearns balancing work and home like a real person would, and of course the kids, Mike, Carol, and Ben, each navigating their own brand of chaos. Mike was the cool, mischievous slacker. Carol was the perfectionist brainiac. Ben was the tag-along little brother who just wanted attention. All of them felt like they could live down the street from you, and for a while it worked. Episodes were breezy but meaningful. You got lessons without the show getting preachy. It was clear the writers knew what they were doing, until one day, they didn't. Or maybe they just ran out of things to say. Somewhere around the 5th season, the show lost its balance. Storylines grew thinner. Mike's goofball charm became repetitive. Carol's intelligence got reduced to punchlines about how boring she was. And Ben, well, Ben just kind of stood around a lot. Desperate to keep things fresh, they pulled the classic sitcom move, add a new kid. In walked Chrissy, the Seavers' surprise 4th child, who suddenly aged 5 years overnight thanks to a little trick called TV time jump. But the shift was obvious. The warmth of the early seasons was replaced with awkward punchlines and recycled plot points. When your show's most exciting twist is, the baby can talk now, you know you have reached that weird sitcom twilight zone. And of course, who could forget the final stretch? the introduction of a very young Leonardo DiCaprio as a homeless teen taken in by the Seavers. This was meant to inject some edge, some depth. But really, it felt like the writers were grasping. There were no new family stories left to tell, so they reached outside the family instead. And yes, Leo would go on to become one of the biggest stars in the world. But back then, even his future talent could not keep the show from sagging under its own weight. By the end, Growing Pains was just that, Growing Pains. A show that did not know when to bow out. It still wanted to be what it was in season 2, but too much had changed. The kids had aged. The jokes had gone stale. The heart was still technically beating, but you had to squint to feel it. And that is the real tragedy, isn't it? Watching something you loved, not knowing when to let go. It had charm, it had chemistry, and for a while, it had something different. Who's the Boss was not just another sitcom in the endless parade of 1980s living rooms. It flipped the script. A retired baseball player, Tony Michelli, takes a job as a live-in housekeeper for Angela Bauer, a high-powered advertising executive and single mother. Suddenly, gender roles were not just hinted at. They were front and center. This was progressive. This was new. This was fun. But like many shows that burn hot early, it kept burning long after it had run out of fuel. At its best, the show was full of lively back and forths and surprisingly deep character work. Tony Danza was impossible not to like, with his thick New York accent and gentle goofball energy. Judith Light brought a grounded intelligence to Angela that made her more than just the straight-laced boss. Their kids, Samantha and Jonathan, added sweetness and occasional chaos. And then there was Mona, Angela's mother, a walking one-liner machine with a martini glass in hand and no filter. Together, it all worked. The show asked, what happens when a man takes care of the home and a woman takes care of the business? It was a good question, but eventually it stopped trying to answer it. As the seasons wore on, the workplace versus home dynamic started to flatten. Plots got more repetitive. The kids, once key to the heart of the show, became background players as the spotlight turned fully toward Tony and Angela. And that spotlight got very bright when the will they won't they tension hit its peak. Ah yes, the classic slow burn sitcom romance. Tony and Angela danced around each other for years, teasing viewers with moments of tenderness and just missed timing. The problem? They waited too long. And by the time the show finally pulled the trigger and put them together, the spark had faded. The thrill of the will they had been stretched so thin that when the answer was finally they will, it felt obligatory. Not exciting, not earned, just overdue. Even the characters themselves began to feel like caricatures of their former selves. Tony, who started out as a smart and loving father trying to build a better life, became increasingly goofy, bordering on cartoonish. Angela, once confident and composed, began to waver in tone, sometimes flustered, sometimes neurotic, rarely the powerhouse she once was. Mona still got her zingers in, but even those began to feel canned. And when the jokes lose their edge, what is left? By the final season, the magic was mostly gone. The show still had a loyal audience, but you could feel the fatigue on the screen and behind it. Characters stayed the same while the world kept changing around them, and maybe that is the hardest thing for a sitcom to face. What once felt modern and fresh can feel dated and stuck if you refuse to move forward. Who's the Boss started as a subversion. It ended as a cliché. And that is not a criticism of the people involved, it is a reflection of what happens when television becomes too comfortable with itself. When the big questions are already answered, but the episodes keep coming. You take the good, you take the bad, and eventually you take one too many seasons. The Facts of Life had a lot going for it early on. It was spun off from different strokes, and unlike a lot of spin-offs, it quickly found its voice. A group of girls at an all-girls boarding school, under the guidance of the firm but loving Mrs. Garrett, navigating the trials of growing up. It had just enough heart, just enough awkward teen comedy, and a strong cast that grew more confident with each season. But then, it kept going. Originally, it started with 7 girls, too many cooks in the kitchen. So the show narrowed its focus to 4 core characters: Blair, the glamorous rich girl, Jo, the tough girl from the Bronx, Natalie, the free spirit, and Tootie, the youngest and most wide-eyed. Each of them represented a different kind of growing up story. And under Mrs. Garrett's watchful eye, they tackled real issues: peer pressure, body image, racism, and even topics like sexual assault and eating disorders. For a sitcom, especially in the early 1980s, that was bold. These were not always easy laughs, but they were honest. The problem is not how the show started. It is how it changed. The girls grew up. That is what they were supposed to do. But instead of letting the show grow up with them, or better yet, letting it gracefully end, the facts of life just kept shifting gears. The school setting was left behind, replaced by a novelty gift shop where the now-adult girls worked together. It was one of those sitcom pivots that felt more like a patch job than a natural evolution. You could almost hear the writers in the background saying, "Well, what now?" And then came the additions. George Clooney, yes, that George Clooney, as a handyman. Mackenzie Aston as Andy, the precocious kid meant to fill in the cute factor that the now-adult cast could no longer supply. Even Mrs. Garrett was eventually written out and replaced by her sister Beverly Ann, played by Cloris Leachman. When you start replacing anchors like that, it is a red flag. You can paint the walls a different color, but if the house is already crumbling, it is not going to hold. By the time it reached its 9th season, The Facts of Life was no longer about facts or life. It was a nostalgia machine running on empty. The themes that once felt daring now felt safe, softened, and wrapped in forced laughter. Characters repeated the same dynamics over and over. Blair was still snobby, Jo was still tough, Natalie still quirky, Tootie still bubbly. But the nuance was gone. They had not evolved, they had looped. There is a real sadness in that, because this was a show that mattered to a lot of people. For girls growing up in the 1980s, it was one of the few shows that took them seriously. It was messy, emotional, empowering television. But it stayed too long. It lost track of its identity. And when a show that once gave people something to hold on to becomes background noise, that is the kind of ending that does not need a finale. It just fades. So imagine this. You are flipping channels in the 1980s, and you land on a show about a sarcastic alien from the planet Melmac who crash lands in a suburban garage and moves in with a regular American family. That is ALF. Absurd, right? Completely. But that was the charm. It was weird, offbeat, and somehow incredibly endearing. At least at first. ALF, short for alien life form, was basically a puppet, voiced and controlled by Paul Fusco, with a love for cats, to eat, not to pet, a gift for sarcasm, and a complete inability to blend in. The Tanner family, your standard suburban household, just rolls with it. Because why not? It was the 1980s. Stranger things had already happened on television. The first few seasons worked because of that off-kilter blend of heart and humor. Alf was crude, but he had depth. He caused chaos, but he meant well. And the Tanners, Willie, Kate, Lynn, and Brian, became something like his adopted family. Episodes touched on loneliness, belonging, and what it means to feel alienated, all under layers of furry slapstick and running gags. It was high concept, but it had soul. But the longer it went on, the more the gimmick wore thin. What started as charming unpredictability turned into recycled chaos. Alf hides in a closet. Alf ruins dinner. Alf builds some weird invention that almost exposes him to the government. You could practically set your watch to the structure. The characters stopped growing because the show itself never really changed. Behind the scenes, it was not pretty either. Working with the ALF puppet was reportedly exhausting. It was an intensely technical shoot, lots of trapdoors, takes, and lighting issues. The cast felt like props to the puppet, and it showed. You can tell in the later seasons that the spark is fading. The jokes are flatter, the chemistry more forced. The novelty had worn off, and what was left was a sitcom with one foot in a plot hole. Worse still, the show ended on a cliffhanger. Not the dramatic kind that gets resolved in a satisfying way. No, this was the kind where the alien you had been rooting for gets captured by the government, and that is it. No rescue. No closure, just a cold stop, as if the writers walked away mid-sentence. It was one of the most bizarrely lovable shows of its time, but it also overstayed its welcome. When you build an entire world around a character who can never change, who can never leave the house, never be revealed, never move forward, you are eventually painting yourself into a very furry corner, and by the time they tried to change the rules, the audience had already checked out. It is a shame, really. ALF had heart, ALF had jokes. But in the end, ALF had no exit strategy. There is something timeless about two opposites living under one roof, one loud, one reserved, one naive and enthusiastic, the other cynical and exhausted. That is the entire premise of Perfect Strangers, and for a while, it was a sitcom goldmine. You had Balky Bartokomous, an endlessly cheerful immigrant from the fictional island of Mypos, moved to Chicago and lived with his distant American cousin, Larry Appleton. And from the second Balky said, "Don't be ridiculous." The audience was hooked. It worked because of the chemistry. Mark Lynn-Baker and Bronson Pinchot had something real between them, something oddly vulnerable, especially in the earlier seasons. Larry, ever the neurotic middle-class striver, was constantly on edge. Balky, wide-eyed and generous, made him look at the world differently. And that friction between culture, personality, and priorities was what gave the show its warmth. It was not just slapstick, it was about empathy, or at least it started that way. As the seasons piled on, though, things shifted. What began as a grounded culture clash sitcom turned into a slapstick circus. By the middle seasons, every episode seemed to end in a farce. Balky and Larry getting stuck in a department store overnight. Balky and Larry accidentally destroying a wedding cake. Balky and Larry trying to raise a sheep in their apartment. The emotional realism that made their friendship special got drowned in pratfalls and misunderstandings. And do not get me wrong, Bronson Pinchot was funny. He had a wild physicality, a sharp comedic rhythm, and a character that could carry a whole scene with just a facial expression. But eventually, it felt like the writers leaned too hard into that. Balky stopped being a character and started becoming a punchline machine. Larry, meanwhile, spent more and more time yelling. The balance that made them work? It slowly fell apart. Part of the issue was that the characters stopped growing. After several seasons of learning, arguing, bonding, and laughing, you would think the dynamic might evolve a little. But it did not. They were still having the same fights. Still misunderstanding each other the exact same way. Still making the same mistakes. And audiences noticed. To try and shake things up, the show did what so many long-running sitcoms do. It aged up the situation. Balky and Larry both got married. They moved into a house. They got jobs. They had kids. The classic sitcom domestic reboot. But by then, the tone had already calcified. The stories were flatter. The charm was recycled. Even the show's final season felt like a quiet afterthought. Episodes shuffled around, not always aired in order, as if the network knew it had already lost momentum. Perfect Strangers was never supposed to last forever. And maybe that is part of why people still look back on it fondly. It had heart, and it gave us some unforgettable moments. But it went past its sweet spot. It kept telling the same story long after the story had already been told. And when a show becomes its own echo, you stop laughing with it and start watching out of habit. Now here is a show that feels like the very definition of ran too long. Charles in Charge had a rocky start, then found its footing, only to trip over itself repeatedly until there was nowhere left to go. The premise was simple enough. Charles, a well-meaning college student, works as a live-in babysitter for a suburban family. Hijinks, heartwarming lessons, and clean-cut chaos ensue. At first glance, it sounds just wholesome enough to work. And for a while, it did. The original run had Charles living with the Pembroke family, a fairly typical nuclear household with kids who needed watching and parents who were just overwhelmed enough to let a college student run the show. Scott Baio played Charles with a gentle charisma. He was the guy you could trust with your kids, your car keys, and probably your taxes too. And the show leaned into that. He was the cool, calm, in-control big brother figure everyone wished they had. But then came the reboot. And by reboot, I mean the show was canceled, then brought back in syndication with a completely different family, the Powells, living in the exact same house. No explanation, no transition, just a brand new set of characters pretending nothing weird had happened. It was jarring. But more than that, it was a sign. A sign that the show was going to keep going whether it made sense or not. As the seasons rolled on, the charm began to wear thin. Charles became less of a relatable, goofy mentor and more of a sitcom robot, solving problems, delivering canned wisdom, and ending every episode with a lesson that felt increasingly hollow. The kids' personalities blurred together. The conflicts felt manufactured, and even the show's gentle humor began to feel like background noise. It was television that looked like a sitcom, but did not feel like one anymore. The supporting cast shifted constantly. Characters disappeared without explanation. Buddies came and went. Charles's best friend, Buddy Lembeck, played by Willie Ames, started off as a lovable sidekick and slowly morphed into comic relief so exaggerated it bordered on the absurd. The longer the show went on, the more it leaned on gimmicks, dream episodes, mistaken identities, and relationship drama that never quite landed. And then there was the tone. What began as a lighthearted family show occasionally dipped into oddly preachy territory. It tried to keep up with changing times but felt stuck in an earlier era, delivering moral messages in a way that felt more performative than sincere. It wanted to be meaningful but could not quite justify it. And the more it tried, the more the seams showed. By the time Charles in Charge finally wrapped up, it had run for 5 seasons, but felt much longer. What started as a refreshing twist on the nanny trope ended up as a case study in sitcom fatigue. The writing got lazy, the structure sagged, and Charles himself, once a symbol of quiet competence, became a guy stuck in place, repeating himself in a loop. Maybe Charles was in charge, but by the end, nobody really knew why anymore. Some shows find success by keeping things simple. Head of the Class was not one of them. From the very first episode, it had a big idea. What happens when a laid-back history teacher walks into a classroom full of overachieving Type A geniuses? It was different from the usual high school comedy, less locker room drama, more debate team chaos, and for a while, that fresh angle worked. But the show kept going, and the longer it stayed, the more it forgot why it worked in the first place. Howard Hesseman played Charlie Moore, a teacher who didn't believe in grades over growth. He challenged his students to think for themselves instead of just chasing the next gold star. The students were a mix of nerds, artists, and oddballs, each with their own quirks and just enough sincerity to balance the sitcom tone. The format had potential. It felt like a halfway point between Welcome Back, Kotter, and The Breakfast Club. But then came the changes. Cast members left. New ones came in. Characters who were once sharp and complex got flattened into single-note versions of themselves. The show started adding more gimmicks to keep things moving. School trips, contests, love triangles, the works. And with each new twist, the original energy faded. Things really started to unravel when Howard Hesseman left in season 4. Charlie Moore was the heart of the show. When he was gone, the whole classroom dynamic shifted. The replacement, played by Billy Connolly, brought a different vibe, louder, zanier, and not quite grounded in the same way. It was not that Connolly was bad, it was that he was in the wrong show. What had once been a thoughtful sitcom with emotional beats turned into a louder, less cohesive version of itself. The students, once interesting and well-rounded, felt stuck. You could see them aging out of high school, but the show would not let them grow. Instead, it looped through the same beats, talented kids being pressured to succeed, moral lessons at the end of every episode, rinse and repeat. The stories became predictable. The warmth turned to routine. It was like watching a school play that had been running for too many semesters. In the end, Head of the Class did what a lot of long-running shows do. It forgot what made it special. It started strong, but stayed too long. And when the bell finally rang, most people had already moved on. There was a time when Kate and Allie felt like the future of sitcoms. Two divorced women, one practical and grounded, the other free-spirited and impulsive, move in together to raise their kids as a blended family. It was smart, it was modern, and in the early 1980s it was kind of radical. You didn't often see two women running the household on television without some kind of traditional man in the center. But like many good ideas, it started aging the moment it stopped evolving. Susan St. James and Jane Curtin had real chemistry. Their friendship felt lived in, messy, and real. It was never just about punchlines, it was about resilience. Two women building a life together, not romantically, but in partnership. It spoke to a changing culture, one that was starting to accept different definitions of family. And for a few seasons, that message held strong. But then, the stories started repeating. The same types of conflicts showed up: dating disasters, parenting dilemmas, family tension. But nothing really changed. The characters, so dynamic at first, fell into rigid roles. Kate was always chasing the next adventure. Allie was always playing it safe. And while the contrast was fun early on, it started feeling static, like the characters were stuck playing versions of themselves instead of growing into anything new. The show also struggled to keep its younger characters interesting. The kids grew up, but not in a way that added anything to the story. Their arcs plateaued. They became background noise. And since so much of the emotional center of the show was built around raising children in an unconventional home, that lack of development left a hole. When Kate and Allie first aired, it was saying something bold. By the end, it was saying very little. The tone became more generic. It was not bad. It was just tired. And that might be the quiet tragedy of so many long-running shows from the 1980s. They captured a moment, but when the moment passed, they did not know how to say goodbye. Sometimes a show is so strange, so completely baffling, that it stops being just a flop and becomes a legend. That is what happened with Turn On, a sketch comedy show that aired one single episode in 1969, right on the edge of a new decade. And then it vanished, canceled before the credits even finished rolling in some markets. Turn On was supposed to be the next big thing. It came from the same producers who gave the world Laugh-In, which had been a massive success. But while Laugh-In felt like controlled chaos, Turn On felt like someone broke a television in half and tried to tape it back together using punchlines and confusion. There was no host, no structure, no laugh track. Just a rapid-fire sequence of disconnected sketches that blasted across the screen like a television signal from another planet. Faces would appear. Jokes would be told, often about sex, race, or politics. And then they would disappear again, over and over. No context, no setup, just pure surreal rhythm. It was shot with extreme close-ups, harsh lighting, and almost no transition between bits. Viewers at home did not know when one sketch ended and another began. Some stations cut the feed mid-episode. Others received angry calls before the first commercial break. One ABC affiliate in Ohio reportedly called the network during the broadcast and said, "If that is a television show, then we are not a television station." The content was not even that offensive by today's standards. But the presentation? That was the problem. It was like watching a sitcom have a nervous breakdown in real time. And no one, not the audience, not the network, not even the cast, seemed ready for it. There is a strange beauty in that kind of failure. Turn On tried something bold. It wanted to reinvent comedy, make it punchier, edgier, faster. But it overshot the mark, by a lot. And in the process, it created one of the weirdest half hours in the history of television. And yet, buried under all the misfires and glitchy edits, there were flickers of brilliance. Some jokes landed, some sketches were ahead of their time. You could feel the potential in the chaos. It just needed another year, another format, another era. Something less buttoned up, something ready for weird. But television in 1969 was not that place. Not yet. And so, Turn On became a cautionary tale. One that producers whispered about for decades. "Do not go full Turn On," they would joke. Because it reminded everyone what could happen when innovation moves faster than comfort. Still, for those who saw it, live raw, and utterly confusing, it stuck. You do not forget a show like that. You do not forget what it felt like to sit in your living room and ask, "What is this?" And maybe that is the real legacy. Turn On did not fail because it was weird. It failed because it was too weird, too soon. But that also made it unforgettable. The New Adventures of Bean. Baxter might be the most 80s thing that ever aired on television. Just say the name out loud. It already sounds like a kid who skateboards on top of the White House. And the show lived up to it. It was about a totally normal teenager whose dad gets kidnapped by an evil organization, so the government secretly recruits him to be a spy. You heard that right. One day, he is doing homework. The next day, he is saving America in his Letterman jacket. And the best part? He is actually kind of good at it. Beans, yes, that was his real name, had everything an undercover agent needed. He was athletic, clever, curious, and had just enough awkward teenage charm to blend into high school and enemy bases. The show was like someone took a Saturday morning cartoon and forced it to wear jeans and drive a convertible. Every episode had secret missions, explosions, absurd disguises, and gadgets that looked like they were made out of calculators and Hot Wheels. The plots made almost no sense, and that was the fun of it. It felt like someone gave a spy agency to the kid from algebra class who never tied his shoes. There was action, sure, but half the tension came from wondering if Beans would make it home before curfew. You would go from science fairs to villain hideouts in a single scene. Beans would get into fistfights in the lunchroom and then use a laser pen to escape a maximum security facility. One time he snuck into a secret lab hidden under a shopping mall. Another time he flew a jetpack through a cornfield. But here is what made it stick with 1980s kids. The show did not make him a superhero. Beans was nervous, confused, and constantly getting in over his head. He still had crushes. He still had curfews. He still got grounded. His mom did not even know he was working for the government. She just thought he was going through a phase. Meanwhile, he is out there dodging laser traps and fighting grown men in turtlenecks. The contrast between suburban life and spy drama was so wild that it started to make sense in its own bizarre way. And the villains? They were cartoonishly over the top. And in a way, we were. Every kid who watched it felt like maybe, just maybe, they had what it took to save the world, as long as they made it home before dinner. The New Adventures of Beans Baxter was short-lived, but it gave every kid permission to dream big, act bold, and maybe sneak a walkie-talkie into their backpack, just in case. Roundhouse was what happened when raw teen energy smashed into a live stage and exploded into music, movement, and unapologetic weirdness. It was not just a sketch show. It was a stage, a rotating one literally, where comedy met chaos and somehow made sense of being a teenager in the 1990s. Roundhouse was messy, loud, and never afraid to take swings at real issues. Divorce, bullying, crushes, loneliness, it tackled all of it. But not with lectures or moral of the day endings. It used dance, it used music, it used fast cuts and louder voices than any adult was ready for. Every episode felt like a fever dream on roller skates, but it worked because it came from truth. This was a show made by young people, for young people, without a single ounce of condescension. The cast felt like your friends, the cooler, weirder ones who actually talked about stuff no one else would. One moment, you would be laughing at a sketch about school lunch. The next, you were suddenly thinking about what it meant to grow up in a broken home. And then, just like that, you were dancing again. Roundhouse made you feel seen, not polished, not perfect, just seen. It was the voice in your head screaming, "Why does no one talk about this?" And then suddenly, they did. It burned bright, burned fast, and left behind a legacy that still feels impossible to replicate. It was not just a kids' show. It was a stage for everything real, messy, and beautiful about growing up. Charles Herbert was not just a child actor. He was the child actor of the 1950s, with over 40 feature films and dozens of television appearances before the age of 16. He was a household name at a time when television was still earning its place in the American living room. Audiences adored him. Studios wanted more of him, and like so many before and after, Charles gave the world every bit of himself before he was old enough to realize what that meant. But the applause that lifted him up became the silence that swallowed him. As he grew older, the roles dried up. His voice changed, his face matured, and suddenly the golden boy of the silver screen was just another forgotten teenager. The transition from child star to adult actor is a narrow bridge few can cross, and Charles slipped through the cracks. The phone stopped ringing. The fan letters stopped coming. The boy who had once earned more than his own parents now found himself struggling to survive. He spoke, later in life, with haunting honesty about the pain of growing up in the spotlight, about being used, managed, and then left behind. He battled addiction, faced poverty, and for years, he vanished from the public eye. But unlike many who disappear in silence, Charles eventually came back, not to act, but to tell his story, to warn others. He never blamed the audience. He never lashed out at the industry. He simply revealed the truth, that childhood is not a commodity. And fame, especially when given to a child, is never a gift without cost. Charles Herbert did not just disappear. He faded, slowly, quietly, and with more grace than the world ever gave him. Supertrain was a show that promised the future and delivered a train wreck. Literally. Picture this, a massive nuclear-powered train that had everything from gyms to swimming pools to full-blown nightclubs, speeding across America like a landlocked spaceship. It was NBC's answer to The Love Boat, except instead of a cruise, you were on rails. And instead of smooth sailing, it was a multi-million-dollar gamble that crashed and burned faster than anyone expected. The production budget was astronomical for its time, higher than anything else on television in 1979. They even built a giant set and miniature models for the train itself. But viewers, they just didn't show up. The stories on board were supposed to be romantic and dramatic and weekly anthologies, but the scripts were flat and the characters forgettable. It aired on Sunday nights, and NBC had high hopes that it would become the next big thing. Instead, Supertrain became the poster child for overambition. Critics tore it apart, and within a few months, it was gone. Still, for a show that failed so spectacularly, it left behind something rare. Footage that looks like retrofuturism exploded all over your screen. It's wild, lavish sets, bright lights, an entire casino inside a train. You cannot look away. It's hard not to respect just how bold it was, even if it collapsed under its own weight. Supertrain was flashy, short-lived, and unforgettable for all the wrong, and maybe just a few right, reasons. Looking back, Holmes and Yo-Yo feels like a glitch in the Matrix, a bizarre little experiment that came and went before anyone could really understand it. But maybe that is why it deserves a second look. Because underneath the pratfalls and robot jokes was a question that never really goes out of style. What does it mean to be human? And who gets to decide? It was silly. It was clunky. It was heartfelt in ways it probably did not mean to be. But more than anything else, it was unforgettable. You have to give credit where it is due. In 1975, ABC took a chance on a sitcom about a rundown hotel full of people society wanted to forget. The title card was missing the E in hotel, and that told you everything you needed to know. Hot L Baltimore was not about perfection. It was about people, complicated, messy, marginalized people, trying to find some kind of dignity in a world that had mostly moved on without them. The show was based on a play by Lanford Wilson, and if you knew the original, you probably blinked twice when you saw it show up in your primetime lineup. This was not your standard family sitcom. The characters included two prostitutes, a transgender woman, an elderly couple fighting eviction, a black militant, and a desk clerk who tried very hard to pretend everything was fine. It was loud, it was messy, it was real. There was no studio audience, no laugh track, just the quiet creaks of a decaying hotel and the strange, beautiful conversations that echoed through its halls. People were angry, people were scared, people were trying to make rent and remember their worth. And somehow, the show managed to turn that into half-hour episodes that left you thinking long after the credits rolled. This was not a show for folks looking to unwind with a light chuckle after dinner. This was for the people who had lived hard days and recognized that same tired look in the eyes of the characters. You did not have to agree with them, but you understood them. Or at least, the show made sure you tried. One of the boldest choices? It let people speak for themselves. The show never stepped in to explain or justify its characters. It did not say, "This is the good guy," or "This is the lesson." It just handed the mic to people you were not used to hearing from on network television and let them talk. And in 1975, that was revolutionary. It only ran for 13 episodes. The network got nervous, sponsors got nervous, viewers wrote letters. Some loved it, many did not. But even those who did not know what to make of it had to admit they had never seen anything like it. And maybe that was the point. Hot L Baltimore was not just a sitcom. It was a crack in the wall, a glimpse at the lives happening just out of sight. It was a reminder that even the forgotten corners of the world are full of voices that matter. And sometimes the weirdest shows are the ones that get the closest to the truth. You might not remember every episode, but you remember how it made you feel. And in the end, that is the kind of show that is too good to forget. Now, Jennifer Slept Here. That one was pure ghostly weirdness, and it hit you with it right out of the gate. A teenage boy moves into a fancy old house in Los Angeles with his parents, only to discover that it is haunted by the ghost of a dead 1950s movie star named Jennifer Farrell. She was bold, brassy, and glamorous. Think Marilyn Monroe with sass dialed up to 11. But only he could see her. Not his mom, not his dad, just him. So basically, imagine being a teenager and having a flirty ghost as your personal mentor/chaotic roommate. That is what we were working with. This show was an absurd blend of spooky and sitcom. Jennifer would pop in and out of scenes, float through walls, and offer life advice in between cracking jokes about Hollywood and haunting the houseplants. And again, only the boy could see her. So imagine what that looked like to everyone else. Talking to thin air, laughing by yourself, arguing with nobody in the living room. If you had that kid in your class, your first thought would not be ghost, it would be get him some help. But because it was the 1980s and television was allergic to subtlety, the show just rolled with it. There were full episodes about Jennifer helping him deal with bullies, crushes, and even homework. She would possess objects, rearrange furniture, and occasionally do impressions of celebrities she literally knew when she was alive. The jokes were fast, the energy was chaotic, and the ghost effects, well, let's just say they were charmingly low budget. Jennifer glowed sometimes, but mostly she just walked around like a regular person. A very sparkly, sassy person with feathered hair and lots of eyeshadow. What made it even weirder was how normal the show tried to make all this feel. The parents were completely unaware. There was no demonology, no dark undertones, no horror. Just, yeah, my house is haunted by a ghost with a killer wardrobe and she is helping me survive high school. Totally chill. The ghost was more helpful than most adults in the kid's life. And as strange as it sounds, the show had some genuinely sweet moments. Jennifer had unfinished business, and helping this awkward, neurotic teenager was her way of staying connected to the world she used to love. It was a short-lived show, only one season, but it left a permanent dent in the minds of 1980s kids. Mostly because it combined things we loved: celebrities, ghosts, secret powers, and comedy that moved faster than you could keep up with. You watched Jennifer Slept Here and felt like you were in on a weird little secret. It was a show that winked at you through the screen and said, being haunted might not be so bad if the ghost is fabulous. And for that brief year, we all wanted to be the kid with the coolest, quirkiest, most undead best friend in town. Cousin Skeeter was the kind of show that made you do a double take the first time you saw it, because there was no warning for how loud, fast, and absolutely unfiltered it was. A puppet, not animated, not digital. A real, in-your-face puppet, dropped right into the middle of a live-action family sitcom like he owned the place. And somehow, he kind of did. Cousin Skeeter was Bobby's cousin, sure, but he was also your cousin, the one who was always saying something wild at the dinner table, getting you in trouble, then making you laugh so hard you forgot why you were mad. He had that energy, the energy that made teachers roll their eyes and kids cheer louder. His jokes hit fast. His entrances were louder than anything else on Nickelodeon. But under all that chaos was something rare. Skeeter, for all his wild behavior, was never mean. He messed up, yeah, but he showed up for Bobby every single time. The show had a rhythm that was impossible to ignore. It blended urban culture, slapstick comedy, and family dynamics in a way that no other show at the time dared to do. And let us not gloss over the fact that it was one of the few kids' shows that put Black culture and Black family life right at the center, without turning it into a lesson. Just life, just jokes, just real. Watching Cousin Skeeter now is like hearing an old mixtape from your childhood. The jokes might land different. The puppet might look a little out of place. But the feeling? Still gold. It was loud and loving and absolutely unique. There is nothing on television today quite like it. And honestly, we were lucky to grow up with it, even if we had no idea what we had until it was gone. Haley Joel Osment saw dead people, and then he saw no one. As the wide-eyed child in The Sixth Sense, he stunned the world. Critics, audiences, directors, everyone called him a prodigy. And for a while, he lived up to every inch of it, role after role, award after award. But then, the industry did what it always does. It moved on. Or maybe Haley did first. He made the boldest move a child star can make. He disappeared by choice, not by scandal. In doing so, he proved that fame did not own him, even when the world tried to claim him. Instead of chasing fame into his teenage years, Haley made a decision most child stars never even consider. He stepped away, went to college, lived among classmates who barely knew he had once terrified Bruce Willis on screen. He studied acting not to keep the fame alive, but to understand it better, to rebuild it on his own terms. And when he did return, it was not as the fresh-faced boy we remembered. It was as a character actor, bearded, funny, strange. He leaned into roles that were bizarre, offbeat, sometimes unrecognizable, and maybe that was the point. He had no interest in being who we remembered. He wanted to be someone new. Haley never really disappeared. He transformed, quietly, with grace. He avoided the crash, the scandal, the tragedy. And somehow, that made him stand out even more. In a world of child stars who vanish under the weight of what they were, Haley Joel Osment simply chose to become something else. If someone told you there was a sitcom in the 1970s about a janitor in space, you would probably laugh. Then you would ask them to prove it, and then you would sit down and watch Quark and wonder how this thing ever got made, and why no one ever talks about it, and why it is so much better than it has any right to be. Quark was created by Buck Henry, the same mind behind Get Smart. So you already knew it would be weird. But this was something else. It took place in the distant future, where a humble man named Adam Quark captains a space sanitation vessel. His job? Collect intergalactic trash. That was the entire premise. And somehow, it worked. The show parodied every science fiction trope you could think of. One week it was Star Wars, the next it was Star Trek. The sets looked like they were made out of cardboard and Christmas lights. The costumes were somewhere between Halloween store clearance and low-budget cosplay. And yet, it had heart. It had rhythm. It had just enough charm to keep you watching. Quark's crew was a beautiful mess. There was Gene and Gene, the identical clones, except one was definitely male and the other definitely female, and no one could agree on who was the original. There was Ficus, the emotionless plant-based humanoid who somehow managed to be more interesting than most humans. And then there was Betty, actually two Bettys, both played by the same actress, one of whom might have been a robot. Or maybe both. It was never entirely clear. And then there was Quark himself. Played by Richard Benjamin, he brought this everyman energy to a character who was constantly in over his head. He was not a hero. He did not want to save the galaxy. He just wanted to do his job and not get vaporized. And somehow, That made him one of the most relatable characters in all of science fiction. Out of This World was the kind of show that made you look at your bedroom light switch and wonder if it could stop time. The premise was totally unhinged in the best possible way. A teenage girl named Evie finds out on her 13th birthday that her dad is an alien, her mom is a regular human, and she now has powers because of their interplanetary love story. Her biggest power? She could press her fingers together and freeze time. Just like that. No rules, no cool-down period, just instant freeze like she was microwaving the world. And that was just episode 1. The show did not even try to be subtle about how weird it was. Evie's alien father, who we never actually saw on screen, would talk to her through a glowing cube on her nightstand. Not a phone, not a space hologram. A cube. It lit up, pulsed with celestial wisdom, and occasionally gave fatherly advice in a James Earl Jones-type voice. Imagine doing your homework while your space dad lectures you from a glowing cube about honesty and Saturn. That was normal for her. And the tone? It wobbled between coming-of-age sitcom and low-budget science fiction with zero shame. One scene would be your typical teen drama, Evie trying to fit in at school or crushing on a boy, and the next scene she would freeze the entire cafeteria and change all the grades, or fast-forward through gym class, or rewind conversations. That was the real fantasy. Not just time travel, but time editing, like if life had a DVR remote and you were in charge of rewrites. That idea alone stuck in every 1980s kid's head. Of course, she was constantly learning that using her powers had consequences, but the show never really explained how or why they worked, and honestly, no one asked. You just accepted that this teenage girl had cosmic powers and a space cube father and moved on. Maybe it was the times, or maybe it was because the 1980s were filled with shows that asked you to believe in the impossible, as long as it had a laugh track and neon lighting. The supporting cast made things even weirder. Her best friend was always suspicious but never quite figured it out. Her uncle was a struggling comic with bad timing and worse luck, and her mom was just cool with all of it, raising a half-alien daughter who could bend time. Sure, whatever, just get your chores done. The lack of panic was almost as strange as the premise. But that is exactly why Out of This World made such a deep mark. It told kids that maybe being weird was not a flaw. Maybe it was your superpower. Evie was not the coolest, the smartest, or the most popular, but she was different. And for every kid watching who felt out of place or misunderstood, that meant everything. The show let you laugh at the awkwardness of growing up while also pretending you could pause your homework with a finger snap. Not a bad deal, if you ask me. There is something about the early 1970s and strange marital sitcoms, shows that asked, what if your wife was not just your wife, but something a little more? That was the setup for The Girl with Something Extra, a show that imagined what would happen if the love of your life could also read your thoughts. Spoiler alert, it was just as awkward as it sounds. Sally Field starred as Sally Burton, a charming, clever newlywed with a secret. She had extrasensory perception. Not just vague feelings or hunches, actual full-on mind reading. Her husband John, played by John Davidson, found out about it right after their wedding. And from that point on, their domestic life turned into a never-ending guessing game. You would think a power like that would make things easier. It did not. Every thought John tried to keep to himself, she heard it. Every half-formed worry, every guilty craving, every impulsive judgment, Sally caught all of it. And no matter how much she tried to tune it out, it always came through loud and clear. The show had the pacing of a traditional sitcom, but the premise gave it a strange, almost futuristic edge. It was like Bewitched without the spells, or I Dream of Jeannie without the bottle. It leaned into the paranoia of marriage and wrapped it in a shiny comedic bow. How do you have an honest conversation with someone who already knows what you are about to say? That was the joke. That was the tension. And somehow it worked. Sally Field was already a known name by then, and her presence gave the show more credibility than it might have otherwise earned. She brought warmth, energy, and this perfect mixture of wide-eyed innocence and sharp timing. John Davidson played the increasingly frazzled husband like a man clinging to a sinking boat, trying not to think about how much he missed his ex-girlfriend or whether his tie made his neck look fat. The show touched on some real emotional truths, even as it played for laughs. The fear of being truly seen, the need for privacy, even in a marriage, the temptation to hide things, not out of cruelty, but because you want to keep something just for yourself, and the quiet, funny terror of realizing that no secret thought is ever really safe. It only lasted one season, just 22 episodes. The concept may have been too weird for primetime audiences, or maybe people just were not ready for a love story that came with telepathy. But those who watched it remember. Not because it was loud or flashy, but because it was different, and quietly honest in a way most shows were not. You might forget the plot of an episode, but you will remember the look on Sally's face when she accidentally heard something she should not have, or the moment when John tried to think about nothing and failed miserably. Because when a show reflects your deepest, most ridiculous fears, that is the kind of weird that is too good to forget. Which of these shows do you think should have ended sooner? Drop your take below, like the video, and subscribe for more.